Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a huge stack of historical analyses, and we're really centering on Stephen Lovell's, his groundbreaking book, The Shadow of War.
Right, Russia and the USSR, 1941 to the present.
Exactly. And our mission today is basically to completely redraw the mental map you might have of modern Russia. Because, usually when you look at a map of an ancient city, you expect the center to be where everything started.
Right. And you look for the old town.
Right.
Yeah.
Look for the original foundation, and you watch how the streets sort of radiate outwards from that point. But imagine looking at a map of this massive, sprawling empire and realizing that the true center, the thing that dictates every road, every boundary, isn't the ancient capital.
It's not the founding document.
No. It's a massive, smoking crater right in the middle of a map. A crater so deep it just, warped the gravity of everything built around it.
And that is exactly what Lovell argues we have to understand. I mean, if we are going to make any sense of the Russian state, historically or even today.
Right.
Because in Western historical analysis, we almost reflexively look for those foundational origin point dates.
Like 1917.
Exactly. The jagged revolutionary white line of the Bolshevik takeover. Or, we skip all the way to 1991 when the Soviet Union officially dissolved.
And we say, boom, there it is, the birth of the modern era.
Right. But Lovell's methodology demands that we discard both of those dates as our primary lenses. To actually map the intellectual and social landscape of this region, you have to begin in 1941.
1941, the invasion.
Yes, the cataclysm of the Great Patriotic War, or what we generally call the Eastern Front of World War II. It didn't just happen to the Soviet Union, it fundamentally altered the DNA of the party state.
So if you open up a news app right now and you look at the headlines coming out of Moscow, you're essentially looking at ghosts.
Singular.
To understand today's geopolitical posturing, the internal crackdowns, you have to dig into the rubble of 1941. You have to look at the trauma, the myths, and the incredibly strategic silences born in that crater. Okay, so let's unpack this. We are talking about a total paradigm shift. Why does 1941 completely overwrite 1917 as the defining Soviet myth?
I mean, I'm looking at Lovell's demographic data here, and I'm genuinely trying to wrap my head around the math. The sheer scale is just paralyzing.
It's beyond human comprehension.
Yeah.
Which is, honestly, precisely why it became the new foundational bedrock.
Right.
Let's look at the raw demographics, because that is the physical manifestation of this crater we're talking about.
Okay.
So the official Soviet statistics, which, by the way, were revised heavily after the fact.
Of course they were.
Right. They eventually settled on roughly 27 million premature deaths during the war.
27 million.
Yes. But Lovell goes deeper into the demographic catastrophe because you have to factor in nearly 3 million displaced citizens who ended up outside the borders and just never returned.
Wait, and Lovell points out the wartime birth deficit too, right?
Exactly. Like the children who are simply never conceived or born because of the sheer scale of the slaughter and the separation of families. When he adds that in, the total population losses push closer to 35 million.
It's staggering.
How does a society simply not collapse under that math? I mean, if the population in 1941 was roughly 200 million, and suddenly 35 million people are just erased from the demographic timeline, who is running the country?
Well, that's the thing. Who is in the factories?
Right.
You're left with a society defined by absence. I mean, you had entire agricultural regions where the male population was practically wiped out.
Wow.
The 1959 census revealed this massive gender imbalance that crippled the Soviet labor force for generations. You had heavy industrial factories where the physical labor was entirely borne by, exhausted women, the elderly, teenagers.
Just to keep things running.
Just to survive. It took until 1956, so 11 years after the war ended, just to get back to that 1941 population baseline of 200 million.
11 years just to break even.
Right. You were talking about a demographic void that completely reshaped family structures, pension systems, and really the baseline psychological security of an entire civilization.
So you have this unimaginable trauma.
Yeah.
But Lovell makes this incredible argument that this specific disaster actually brought about a bizarre form of archaeological rebirth for the Soviet project.
It sounds counterintuitive.
Completely counterintuitive until you look at what was happening right before the invasion.
Exactly. Let's look at the 1930s.
Because the state was essentially tearing itself apart from the inside. You had Stalin's Great Terror, the purges of the military, the intelligentsia, the forced collectivization. The state was demanding these extreme sacrifices for a fabricated, paranoid class war against internal enemies of the people.
And those enemies were, more often than not, just innocent neighbors.
Right.
The 1930s was a period of severe self-inflicted ideological exhaustion. I mean, the terror was totally arbitrary. The public had to constantly perform loyalty to a state that might execute them tomorrow based on an anonymous denunciation.
Just pure paranoia.
Pure paranoia. But June 22nd, 1941, changes the entire equation. The invasion by Nazi Germany provided a genuine, existential, external enemy.
The ideology suddenly had a real-world application.
Precisely. The regime wasn't just demanding that you sacrifice your food for some abstract 5-year plan anymore, or a paranoid purge. It was demanding you fight to literally prevent the physical annihilation of your family.
So the defense of the grand socialist motherland perfectly merged with the defense of your actual physical home.
Exactly. And the psychological relief of that, as twisted as it sounds, must have been very real.
You finally have a real enemy instead of wondering if your coworker is going to send you to the gulag.
Yes.
And this leads directly to what Lovell calls the cult of the Great Patriotic War. This heroic narrative of victory that entirely takes over the state's identity. But, to maintain a pristine heroic myth, you have to enforce incredible silences.
Oh, absolutely.
The state has to aggressively manage what the population is allowed to remember.
Memory management becomes a core function of the state apparatus. To elevate 1945 as the ultimate vindication of the Soviet system, the state had to essentially quarantine the memory of the 1930s.
Right. Lock it away.
Today, even in modern Russian public discourse, the 1930s are frequently and vaguely dismissed as a, quote, complex and tragic era.
Oh, complex. Right.
It's a rhetorical sleight of hand. By calling it complex, they avoid any real moral reckoning with Stalin's internal terror. The narrative implies, yes, mistakes were made, but look at the glorious victory we achieved.
So the victory retroactively absolves the regime of its prior crimes.
Exactly.
It's less like a family ignoring a sinkhole in their living room and more like a society suffering from collective phantom limb syndrome.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, the state amputated massive parts of its own population in the 30s during the purges and again in the 40s during the war. And instead of treating the trauma, the government essentially outlawed acknowledging the missing limbs. They just demanded everyone run a patriotic marathon anyway.
Right, just keep running.
And Lovell details the specific historical facts that had to be legally and culturally erased to make this work. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 is a glaring one.
Oh, massive. The Non-Aggression Pact, where the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany literally carved up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence.
Right.
The heroic narrative relies on the idea of the Soviet Union as the ultimate unyielding anti-fascist bulwark. Acknowledging that Stalin actively collaborated with Hitler to partition Poland and annex the Baltic states, well, that shatters the moral high ground entirely.
And it wasn't just the pact. It was the atrocities committed by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, in those very territories before the Germans even invaded.
Yes, okay.
Right.
Correct.
Lovell points to the Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish military officers and intellectuals were taken into the forest and executed by the Soviets. For decades, the official Soviet line was that the Nazis did it.
They completely fabricated the historical record to maintain the myth of the flawless liberator. We have to be clear here, looking at Lovell's data impartially as historians, these cover-ups were systematic state policies to hide objective atrocities.
Exactly. We're just looking at the data points of how the myth was built. But the memory management didn't just cover up geopolitical crimes. It also covered up moments of profound state weakness, right?
Yes, and one of the most fascinating silences Lovell unpacks is the mass panic in Moscow in October 1941.
Oh, this blew my mind. As the German forces are getting dangerously close to the capital, the official mythology says the people of Moscow stood firm. Unshakable heroes digging trenches.
But Lovell's data shows the exact opposite.
Reality was a complete breakdown of civil order.
Utter chaos. When rumors spread that the government ministries were packing up and evacuating eastward to Kubyshev, the population panicked. People literally smelled the ash in the air from party officials burning state documents.
Wow.
The metro system stopped running because they were preparing to dynamite it.
Dynamite their own metro.
Yes. People looted abandoned stores. Factory managers fled with company cash. The state completely lost control of its own capital for several days.
That is wild.
Order was only restored when Stalin decided to stay, and the NKVD was issued draconian orders to shoot looters and, quote, cowards on sight.
So they reasserted control through pure violence.
Exactly. But in the cult of the Great Patriotic War, Soviet citizens are only ever depicted as resolute. The ambiguity, the panic, the instances where citizens in occupied territories actively collaborated with the Germans out of hatred for Stalin, all of it is scrubbed clean.
So if the state is deliberately enforcing this massive silence over the 1930s and its wartime blunders, that requires an incredible amount of logistical control. You can't just mandate national amnesia with a weak government.
No, you cannot.
How did the actual machinery of the Soviet state change to enforce this new reality? Because it couldn't be the exact same system that operated in 1937.
And this is where we really have to examine the architecture of power. Because the war didn't just change the narrative, it fundamentally evolved the Soviet political machinery.
Okay, walk us through that.
Lovell defines the cycle of Soviet governance as an unpredictable alternation between radical upheaval, like the 1917 revolution, or the forced collectivization of the early 30s, followed by retrenchment and reaction, and then periods of structured change or reform.
So a cycle of chaos, cracking down and then reforming.
Right. And the 1930s state was essentially a terror-driven monolith. The war forced it to become a highly adaptable, militarized bureaucracy.
Let's look at the relationship between the Communist Party and the state's security apparatus, the secret police. Because in the late 1930s, the NKVD became so powerful that it was acting like a parasite eating its host.
Yes.
It was almost swallowing the Communist Party whole. You had high-ranking, dedicated Bolsheviks terrified of a knock on the door at midnight.
The Great Terror threatened to consume the very institution that was supposed to guide the Marxist-Leninist project. The secret police became the ultimate arbiter of life and death, superseding the party's political authority.
But then 1941 happens.
Right. The logistical nightmare of the invasion changes that dynamic entirely. The state quickly realized that you cannot run a total war with terror alone.
Right. You can't use the secret police to efficiently evacuate thousands of heavy industrial plants from Ukraine to the Ural Mountains.
Exactly. You can't use them to maintain civilian morale or organize complex supply lines.
They needed middle managers. They needed people who actually knew how things worked, not just people who knew how to interrogate someone.
Precisely. They needed the Communist Party's organizational structure. They needed the party cadres, the regional secretaries, the people who could actually interface with the population and manage the wartime economy.
So the party, which had been decimated by Stalin's purges, suddenly becomes indispensable again.
Yes, the war effectively rebalanced the party-state dynamic. It pulled power slightly away from the pure terror apparatus and distributed it back into a massive, militarized administrative bureaucracy.
Which brings us to the aftermath of Stalin's death in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev's taking power. This leads to the famous period of de-Stalinization, specifically Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in 1956.
A huge turning point.
Right, and this is usually taught in history class as this rare moment of moral clarity. Like, the regime finally takes a hard look in the mirror, admits the horrors of the 1930s, and tries to reform. But Lovell completely strips the romanticism away from that event.
Oh, completely. It wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was a deeply cynical, brilliant, and highly opportunistic tactical maneuver.
Unpack that. Why cynical?
To understand the secret speech, you have to understand the political calculus of the mid-1950s. Khrushchev and his main rivals, men like Malenkov and Molotov, they were all part of Stalin's inner circle.
Right, they were there.
They were all deeply complicit in the bloodletting of the Great Terror. They literally signed the death warrants.
So if Khrushchev is guilty of the terror too, why on earth would he bring it up? Why rip that Band-Aid off in front of the entire party Congress?
Because by being the first to speak out, he frames himself as the reformer. He becomes the savior of the party. He dictates the terms of the confession. In the secret speech, Khrushchev very carefully limits the blame. He blames the excesses entirely on Stalin's cult of personality and the rogue leadership of the secret police.
So he just scapegoats them.
Yes. By doing this, he completely absolves the Communist Party as an institution. Furthermore, he traps his rivals. If men like Malenkov try to defend Stalin, they look like monsters. If they agree with Khrushchev, they are subordinating themselves to his narrative.
It was a masterstroke of political immunization.
It really was.
He controlled the narrative boundary of who gets blamed and who gets saved. But there's another layer to this, tying back to our main theme. Khrushchev wasn't just distancing himself from the terror, He was actively reclaiming the memory of the war from Stalin.
Yes,
He
exactly.
shifted the historical narrative to say, Stalin was a paranoid micromanager who ignored intelligence warnings about the 1941 invasion,
Huh?
and it was actually the heroic Communist Party and the Soviet people who won the war despite Stalin's early blunders.
He weaponized the memory of 1941 to consolidate his own power in 1956. And this architecture of power, this reliance on narrative control, bureaucratic maneuvering, and state dominance over all resources, it creates a structural habit that long outlasts the Soviet Union itself.
This is a crucial point in Lovell's book. If you trace this architecture forward to the collapse of the USSR in 1991, what emerged wasn't a blank slate.
Not at all.
Western observers thought, great, the ideology is gone, now we get a liberal democracy. But what remained were the deep institutional reflexes of that wartime and post-war Soviet era. A total lack of political transparency, an absolute reliance on patron-client networks behind closed doors, and this specific phenomenon we see today, the Siloviki.
The Siloviki, yes. The men of force. It refers to the massive cross-contamination of economic, security, and military elites in modern Russia.
Right.
In a liberal democracy, you generally have firewalls between these sectors, but the Soviet system erased those boundaries.
To understand the Siloviki using an analogy, imagine if the CEO of ExxonMobil, the director of the CIA, and a four-star Army general all went to the same fraternity, swapped jobs with each other every few years, and answered to the exact same boss.
That's terrifyingly accurate.
The lines between corporate business, state espionage, and military force completely blurred into one unified block of power.
And that is the direct legacy of a state where political power was inextricably intertwined with economic control, because the state owned everything. When the Marxist-Leninist ideology finally withered away and the state collapsed, the fight wasn't over competing political philosophies. It was a brutal, bare-knuckle struggle for the control of physical resources.
And the people best positioned to grab those resources were the ones already running the state's security and bureaucratic apparatus.
Exactly.
It is the ultimate irony of the Soviet experiment. I mean, a Marxist state which is fundamentally obsessed with the idea that economics drives all political development ultimately devolves into a system where political power is just a blunt instrument used to capture natural resources.
Right.
You look at the consolidation of power around state-dominated energy behemoths like Gazprom today, and it's not a new post-Soviet invention. It's the culmination of a decades-long structural reality born out of the militarized party state of the 1940s.
But we have to pivot here for a second. We've been looking at the macro level of Kremlin politics, this high-stakes struggle for control. But how does that machinery actually function on the ground?
Right, for the average person.
Exactly. How did everyday people survive this unyielding, monolithic system, especially after the unimaginable trauma we discussed at the start?
To understand that micro level, Lovell leans on a concept coined by the historian Moshe Lewin, the quicksand society. I love this term because it perfectly captures the physical and psychological reality of the Soviet citizen.
The quicksand society describes a population that has been subjected to continuous violent upheaval to the point where no one can find firm social footing.
Wow.
Think about the timeline for an average Soviet citizen born in, say, 1900. They lived through the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, the violence of the 1917 revolution, a brutal civil war, the forced collectivization of the late 1920s, which uprooted millions of peasants.
And then the crash industrialization that forced millions into rapidly built, chaotic urban centers.
Right. Then the Great Terror of the 30s, and then the displacement of tens of millions during World War II.
They're constantly being churned. And yet, if you look at the official Marxist sociology published by the state at the time, they claimed society had reached a harmonious equilibrium.
On paper, everything was perfect.
Right. They claimed there were only three neat categories left: workers, peasants, and the intelligentsia. Lovell points out how entirely fictional that framework was. It was a theoretical straitjacket that completely ignored the real, often violent fractures within the society.
The state's categories were practically useless for understanding how people actually lived. I mean, the real divides weren't worker versus peasant. The most glaring divide was between the free population and the millions of citizens incarcerated in the Gulag forced labor system.
That's a pretty massive divide.
Huge. And you had massive divides between the relatively privileged, rapidly growing urban centers and the deeply impoverished, exploited rural villages that were essentially left to rot to subsidize industrial growth.
Wow.
You had divides between the educated, specialized elites and the manual laborers working in desperate, dangerous conditions.
So the ideology just couldn't contain the messy reality of survival. But Lovell notes that after the war, something subtle but profound shifted. The state and the population were utterly, completely exhausted.
They had nothing left.
The regime recognized, even if they wouldn't admit it on paper, that they could not sustain the fever-pitch, total mobilization of the 1930s indefinitely. They had to offer the survivors something in return for winning the war.
And this is where Lovell introduces the concept of the Soviet personal sphere, or lichnia sobstvennost.
Okay, define that for us.
This is a vital conceptual distinction. We cannot look at this through the Western dichotomy of public versus private. In the West, the private sphere implies a zone shielded from the state. Your home is your castle, the government needs a warrant to cross the threshold, and your political views inside that home are your own business.
Right.
The Soviet personal sphere was not a zone of political freedom. It did not grant you privacy from the KGB.
Wait, so they didn't get privacy from the state, they just got a sanctioned place to put a TE. What exactly was the concession here?
The concession was a state-sanctioned space for personal life, emotional intimacy, and limited consumption. The state began to legitimately recognize that citizens had a right to personal property, not the means of production. You couldn't own a factory, but you could own consumer goods.
Domestic appliances, radios, clothing.
Exactly. And most importantly, the state changed its approach to housing.
This brings us to the Khrushchev era in the late 1950s and 60s, and the massive construction of the Khrushchevkas. These were those identical, 5-story, prefabricated concrete apartment buildings that still dominate the skyline of almost every city in the former Soviet Union.
To appreciate the impact of the Khrushchevkas, you have to understand what came before them. The kommunalka, the communal apartment.
Oh, right.
Before this housing drive, you would have grand pre-revolutionary apartments that the state had subdivided. You might have 7 different families living in 7 different bedrooms, all sharing one single kitchen and one bathroom.
That sounds like a nightmare.
The lack of privacy was total. Your neighbors knew what you ate, who you brought home, and what you whispered about. It was an environment perfectly designed for surveillance and petty, paranoid denunciations.
So when millions of Soviet families finally got the keys to a Khrushchevka, even though the ceilings were low and the walls were thin, they had their own front door.
They had their own private kitchen.
The psychological shift of being able to close your door and sit down with just your immediate family must have been revolutionary.
It really was. It allowed for the cultivation of emotional intimacy and a life focused on the family unit rather than the collective mass.
And you can actually trace this sociological shift through the cinema of the post-war thaw era, right?
Yes.
During the war and the late Stalin period, Soviet films were grand, sweeping socialist epics. The hero was a tractor driver who exceeded his quota, or a soldier who stoically died for the motherland. The collective was everything. The individual's inner life was totally irrelevant.
But if you look at the masterpieces of the late 50s, like Mikhail Kalatozov's The Cranes Are Flying or Sergei Bondarchuk's The Fate of a Man, the focus violently shifts inward.
They are suddenly looking at the deep, personal, emotional damage inflicted by the war.
Exactly. The Cranes Are Flying is fundamentally about a woman who makes a mistake, who fails to be the perfect waiting fiancé, who is deeply flawed and traumatized by the bombing of Moscow.
The heroism in these films isn't about planting a flag on a hill.
No, it's about grieving individuals trying to reassemble the shattered pieces of their personal lives. It's a profound validation of individual trauma over collective triumph.
But Lovell raises a fascinating question about the long-term sociological impact of granting this personal sphere. By allowing the population to retreat into the personal, by letting them focus on the survival of their family unit within these new isolated apartments. Did the Soviet state inadvertently lay the groundwork for the extreme social atomization we see in post-Soviet society today?
That is a brilliant connection. Think about modern Russian society. It's often described as an archipelago of isolated islands.
Right. You have the healthcare island, the corporate oil and gas island, the Rust Belt industrial island, the political elite island. And the people on these islands fiercely defend their borders.
They hoard their resources.
And they do not communicate with the other islands. There's very little broad civic trust. The idea that you and a stranger in a different city are engaged in a shared civic project.
You can see that lack of trust as a direct inherited legacy of Soviet survival networks. You trusted your immediate family, you trusted your closest circle of friends in your private kitchen, and you viewed the state, the bureaucracy, and everyone else outside that circle with deep, ingrained suspicion.
Wow. And that concept of isolated, suspicious islands of society naturally scales up when we look at the geographical map. The Soviet Union wasn't just a political state. It was a vast, multi-ethnic internal empire.
Yes.
And managing that empire from the center in Moscow required policies that directly contradicted the state's own founding ideology.
This is one of the most glaring paradoxes of the whole Soviet project. Officially, the USSR was a vanguard anti-imperialist state. Its entire global brand was rallying against Western capitalist colonialism.
Workers of the world, unite.
Exactly. But internally, it functioned exactly like a 19th century colonial empire. It subjected its own population, both ethnic Russians and non-Russians, to massive internal colonization.
Like collectivization.
Yes, we mentioned that earlier. Lovell and other historians frequently refer to collectivization as a second serfdom. The state essentially tied peasants to the land, confiscated their grain at gunpoint, and brutally exploited their labor to fund the industrialization of the urban centers.
That is a colonial extraction model, just executed entirely within their own borders.
It was an empire that colonized itself, but this imperial mindset became terrifyingly explicit during the war, specifically through the weaponization of geography. The paranoia of the 1941 invasion led the Soviet regime to engage in preventive wholesale ethnic cleansing. The sender viewed entire nationalities as potential fifth columns traitors in waiting simply because of their ethnicity.
Lovell details the logistics of this, and it's just chilling. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people. The Volga Germans, who had lived in Russia for centuries, were rounded up. The Chechens and Ingush in the North Caucasus. The Crimean Tatars.
Entire nations were given literally hours to pack whatever they could carry. They were loaded onto cattle trains and forcibly deported from their ancestral homelands to the harsh environments of Central Asia and Siberia.
It wasn't about punishing individuals who had collaborated.
Not at all. It was a massive, violent re-engineering of the demographic map based on pure imperial suspicion.
And while these minority groups were being marginalized, deported, or erased, the war was simultaneously solidifying a dominant ethnic Russian identity at the center of the empire.
A huge ideological pivot.
Because before the war, Soviet patriotism was supposed to be super ethnic. It was about the global socialist brotherhood. It didn't matter if you were Russian, Georgian, or Kazakh.
Right.
But during the darkest days of the war, the regime realized that abstract Marxist solidarity wasn't enough to make men charge German machine guns. So they leaned heavily on traditional blood-and-soil Russian nationalism.
They brought back the uniforms of the Tsarist army. They made movies glorifying medieval Russian heroes like Alexander Nevsky.
And this ideological shift culminated in a very specific, highly symbolic moment. Stalin's infamous victory toast in May 1945. At a massive reception for Red Army commanders in the Kremlin, Stalin stood up. He didn't toast the great Soviet people or the triumph of international socialism.
Yeah.
He specifically raised his glass to the Russian people, declaring them the leading force, the most outstanding nation of all the republics in the USSR.
That toast permanently altered the dynamic. The pretense of an equal socialist brotherhood was effectively over. It was now explicitly a hierarchy, an empire with ethnic Russians at the top, dictating the terms to the peripheries.
And the tragic consequences of these imperial policies, the arbitrary redrawing of borders, the ethnic deportations, the elevation of Russian dominance, they exploded when the Soviet Union began to weaken.
The center had essentially created deep ethnic fault lines and then frozen them in place through state coercion.
So when Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost in the late 1980s, lifting that coercion, the violence was inevitable. Lovell points specifically to the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh in 1988, a disputed enclave between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
And the central leadership in Moscow was completely unequipped to handle it. Gorbachev and the Politburo were still trying to interpret the violence through the outdated lens of Marxist class warfare.
They didn't get it.
They literally couldn't understand that Armenians and Azerbaijanis were fighting over ancient territorial and ethnic grievances. Moscow's policies over the previous decades had both suppressed these historical nationalisms and, perversely, inadvertently nurtured them by defining everyone rigidly by their official nationality and their internal passports.
It reveals the total blindness of the imperial center to the realities of its own periphery. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating paradoxes of the Soviet collapse, perfectly embodied by the situation in Chechnya.
Yes, Dzhokhar Dudayev.
I want to slow down here because this detail about Dudayev is a massive aha moment. When we think of the brutal Chechen wars in the 1990s, the narrative is usually about a radical, separatist outsider leading a rebellion against the Russian center. But look at Dudayev's background.
It's incredible.
Hold on. The guy leading the rebellion against Moscow wasn't some radical outsider who hated the Soviet system from day one. He was literally forged by the Soviet system. He was a highly decorated major general in the Soviet Air Force.
He commanded a nuclear bomber division in Estonia. He was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He was the absolute epitome of the integrated Soviet elite.
That completely shatters the narrative that 1991 was simply an invasion of Western democratic ideals tearing the system down. Dudayev learned about nationalism and independence movements while serving as a Soviet commander watching the Estonians push for freedom.
Exactly.
The post-Soviet nationalism that tore the country apart was often born right inside the belly of the Soviet beast. It was an inside job by the empire's own middle managers.
Which leads Lovell to a profound reframing of the end of the Cold War. If we view 1991 not as a democratic revolution, but as the delayed, incredibly messy decolonization of the last great 19th century European empire, well, the subsequent political and ethnic turmoil makes a lot more sense.
It totally changes the perspective.
The violence wasn't an anomaly of the transition. It was the standard, brutal process of an empire fracturing along the fault lines it had created.
And having analyzed how Moscow controlled its internal empire, we have to look outward. Because the mechanics of that internal control, the reliance on coercion, the paranoia, the misunderstanding of local realities, directly inform the disastrous miscalculations the Soviet Union made on the global stage during the Cold War.
Let's examine Stalin's geopolitical mindset immediately after World War II. The conventional Western narrative often portrays Stalin as a global Marxist visionary, obsessively plotting world revolution and global communist domination.
Right, the cartoon villain.
Exactly. But Lovell argues that this completely misreads Stalin's motivations. Stalin wasn't operating like a Marxist visionary. He was operating almost exactly like a 19th century czar. His primary obsession was old world territorial security.
He looked at the smoking crater of 1941, he looked at the 35 million dead, and he decided, never again, we need a physical shield.
Yes.
He wanted a massive territorial buffer zone in Eastern Europe to absorb any future land invasion from the West.
But Stalin's framework was profoundly anachronistic. He believed that after the war, the world would eventually return to a multipolar system like the 1920s or 30s, where the capitalist powers like Britain, France, and the US would inevitably fall out and fight each other over markets,
leaving the Soviet Union secure behind its new Eastern European buffer.
Exactly. He completely failed to realize that the geopolitical reality had shifted fundamentally. The world was no longer a multipolar chessboard. It had hardened into a bipolar superpower standoff between the United States and the USSR.
So his aggressive land grab in places like Poland and East Germany, which he viewed entirely as a defensive security measure, was interpreted by Washington as the first step in a campaign of global conquest.
Right.
Stalin's attempt to build a medieval wall around his empire actually triggered the exact global confrontation he desperately wanted to avoid.
And as the Cold War evolved and expanded into the global South, the Soviet Union's miscalculations became increasingly ideological. They looked at the wave of decolonization sweeping through third world nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, places like Angola, Vietnam, and later Afghanistan.
And the Soviet leadership assumed that because these countries were throwing off Western imperialism, they were naturally, historically predetermined to progress towards Soviet-style socialism.
But this was a massive, arrogant misapplication of their own Marxist timelines. They were trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Marxism, theoretically, requires an advanced, industrialized capitalist society to have a workers' revolution.
Right, Marx wrote about factory workers in London, not farmers in Angola.
Precisely. But the Soviets were looking at deeply agrarian, tribal, or religiously conservative societies and trying to aggressively fast-track them into socialist vanguard states.
It was a severe ideological blind spot. But the hubris in Moscow, particularly during the Brezhnev era in the 1970s, was immense. The U.S. had just lost in Vietnam, the Soviet Union had achieved nuclear parity, and oil prices were high, filling Moscow's coffers.
They felt invincible.
Buoyed by this, Soviet leaders acted as global patrons. They poured vast resources, sophisticated weaponry, and thousands of military advisors into proxy conflicts across the globe. They genuinely believed the correlation of forces was moving inevitably in their direction.
But in reality, they were walking blindly into a trap of imperial overstretch that would bleed their domestic economy dry.
Which brings us to the ultimate, catastrophic culmination of this policy, the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979.
Afghanistan was the ultimate ideological trap. The Soviet leadership intervened to prop up a local, radical Marxist regime in Kabul that was deeply unpopular, brutally violent, and utterly incapable of surviving against rural Islamic resistance.
And Moscow thought it would be easy.
The Politburo hesitated at first, but ultimately their imperial reflexes kicked in. They thought it would be a quick, limited police action. Assassinate the erratic leader Hafizullah Amin, install a more compliant socialist, secure the southern border, and leave.
Instead, they pushed mechanized columns into mountainous terrain against a deeply motivated guerrilla insurgency, and it became a decade-long bloodbath.
A total quagmire.
But more profoundly than the military failure, Lovell points out the global ripple effects. The Soviet intervention inadvertently catalyzed and radicalized global Islamism. We have to note the specific detail Lovell highlights here. The Afghan War became the formative crucible for a new generation of militants, most notably a young Osama bin Laden.
The war in Afghanistan shattered the neat, bipolar world order of the Cold War. It introduced a new, non-state geopolitical force that viewed both the Soviet Union and the United States as imperial enemies.
It's easy in the West to view Soviet Cold War maneuvers as a cartoonish plot for world domination. But Lovell's data strips that away. He shows us that both Washington and Moscow were making tragic, catastrophic misreadings of local third-world conflicts, viewing complex civil wars entirely through their own paranoid superpower lenses.
Both sides were blinded by ideology.
Focusing on the Soviet side, I have to challenge this. If the Soviet Union's ideology was so incredibly rigid, how did they justify such pragmatic, often contradictory geopolitical gambles? They allied with completely un-Marxist, brutal dictators in the Middle East and Africa just to deny the Americans a foothold. How does that square with the ideology?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the core tension of Soviet foreign policy. The answer lies in the total fusion of ideology and imperial statecraft. For the Soviet leadership, the very existence and survival of the Soviet state was, by definition, the advancement of socialism.
Oh, I see.
Therefore, any pragmatic, cynical gamble that strengthened Moscow's geopolitical hand, even allying with a non-communist dictator, was ideologically justified because it protected the mothership of the revolution.
The end justifies the means on a global scale.
Exactly. But eventually, the messy, complex reality of the world refused to conform to their rigid ideological blueprint. The financial and moral cost of maintaining this global facade bankrupted the system entirely.
So bringing all these threads together, what Stephen Lovell's book absolutely proves is that the Soviet system was never the static, unchanging totalitarian monolith that we often picture.
It was constantly evolving.
It was a constantly mutating entity, a massive bureaucratic organism forever reacting to and shaped by the massive trauma, the extreme violence, and the ultimate victory of 1941. That war is the key to the entire code.
It dictated everything.
It dictated how the state controlled its people, how it designed its cities, how it managed its ethnic minorities, and how it fought the Cold War.
1941 is the defining matrix, and Lovell's conclusion leaves us with a profound framework for analyzing the present day. He suggests that the greatest struggle of post-1991 Russia has not been the transition to democracy or a market economy, as the West naively hoped.
What was it then?
The greatest, most violent struggle has been the attempt to disentangle a modern nation-state from the deep psychological ghost of a sprawling empire. The physical borders of the state shrank in 1991, but the imperial reflexes, the reliance on hypercentralization, the paranoia about internal enemies, and the absolute obsession with maintaining a defensive buffer zone in Eastern Europe remain deeply ingrained in the architecture of power.
So if you look at Russia's geopolitical maneuvering today, if you read the headlines about their actions in neighboring states, the demands they make on the global stage, you have to ask yourself what you are really looking at. Are you seeing a new 21st century strategy being developed? Or when you look closely at that map, are you just seeing the long, unresolved shadow of that massive crater from 1941 still stretching its jagged edges across the world?